Thank you for watching the video. If this kind of content is something that you would enjoy going forward, please consider throwing out a like, a comment, and a subscribe. That way, you won't miss any of the action. Good afternoon, gamers. Jero back, and we are here to yap about the top placing deck list from this weekend's events. We had the, what was it called? CCT 10K event. I think it ended up being like a 12K, they said, over in Atlanta. And then we had the 10K that happened in Vegas, of course, at the SEG Con. And I have in front of me the top 2 decks from each of those events. And I kind of just wanted to do a little yapping because realistically, I think if you're going to Houston or just playing in your locals, right? I think these are the 4 decks that you should expect to play against the most. And you, in order to be efficiently prepared, you should have a plan against all 4 of them, right? So, yeah, I'm excited, and I'm ready to just get right on into it. So, we'll start with Vegas. This was the first place deck in the 10K at Vegas. It defeated Kaisa in the finals, which we will talk about afterwards, of course. But this is interesting for a few reasons. So first, obviously, the entire Chinese meta, while neither of these are actual regional qualifiers, I don't think, from my understanding, that the East has any kind of events that are similar to these, because these were much higher level of competition than like the city championships, for example, right? Those were much more like a glorified local event from my understanding, whereas these are much more akin to what a regional qualifier is going to look like, just with a smaller pool of players. Another thing interesting about this Annie list is Red Annie, and for reference, this is probably the deck that I have the most in-depth analysis on, mostly because Annie is a deck that I've been playing a bunch of. It's what I played at the 10K in Vegas as well, where I finished 7-2, a very modest 7-2, where I went 23rd, so I didn't get any prizing for that, unfortunately. The tournament realistically probably needed a 10th round. There were a lot of weird situations going on at the top end of the standings, that hopefully OP will figure out down the road, but this is their first time really running a card game in person, so I have hope that they will figure that out, and I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. But yeah, so like I said, I have more reps on Annie than any other archetype at the moment, and it is my front runner for Houston for myself. So yeah, I think Red Annie, very interesting, right? It's particularly interesting given that you're only playing the 3 Void Seekers and the 1 Falling Star main and then the second in the board. My suspicion, though I did not actually interact with Robert W. at all over the weekend, is that this paired with Falling Star is a pretty good way to line up your cards against Kaisa, right? Because it turns your Void Seeker into a removal against Darius, and it turns your Falling Stars into removal against Kaisas and Hopefuls. And it just brawls a little bit bigger, right? So even though I am personally a purple Annie enjoyer, and there was another Annie in this top 8 as well that was purple Annie as well, that is still the direction that I would lean personally, especially if going forward the Kaisa list are going to be trimming on hopefuls and leaning into the more aggressive approach like what Ting Feng did in the event. I think that there's a lot of merit to that. Since they don't play the hopefuls quite as efficiently as Annie does, right? Stack Deck just enables hopefuls and Darius so well that I think it's pretty hard to justify not playing decent numbers of those cards. Whereas Kaisa, it's a little bit more, it kind of requires you to maybe have to use a Stupefy in a weird way, or use a Hextech Ray in a weird way, to activate Darius sometimes, which by no means is a huge flaw, because Darius is so powerful, and Hopeful is so powerful, but just something to consider. Other notable things about this list is surprisingly close to mine in a lot of, not necessarily in overall card selection, but in card philosophy. I'm also playing a One of Gust and a One of Rebuke in my deck at the moment. I'm not playing the Falling Star, but the idea behind a lot of these one-ofs is something that I've hinted at in other videos. I think with the uh I think with the access to Traveling Merchant and Zon Warrens, and most importantly Stack Deck, I think you have a lot of agency over the cards that you have access to in any given game. And I think that rewards very low floor, high ceiling cards. And what I mean by that is, generally speaking, you want cards, if you don't have a bunch of card filtering or card draw, that are always pretty good, right? It's like really hard to justify playing a card that can be really good, but can also be very, very bad. And that dynamic just doesn't really exist in a lot of these purple decks, but Annie in particular, right? So because of the existence of Purple Annie in a lot of versions, even though this version is not using that, you can always discard the cards that have a very high floor, or high ceiling, I mean, when they're not going to be very good, or if you're in a matchup where they're not very good. And then you can always Purple Annie them back if a situation comes up where they would be. Or also, it's just quite a bit easier to find them in general in the matchups where they are good, right? A lot of the arguments for playing cards like Sabotage or a bunch of main deck rebukes or these things that have real potential downside if you draw too many of them, it's much less relevant here, right? Because it's so easy to be able to discard extra copies, and then if you turn out to need them down the road, you can just get them back, or you can just save them for a point in the game where they're very good, right? You have a lot more agency over decisions like that than other decks, and you also get a lot more value out of these cheaper, more efficient cards than other decks, because you just get to leave them up accidentally while still adding to your board, whereas other decks have to actively choose to leave them up, and a lot of times to a good player, that's going to telegraph a lot of information, right? So, something that happened in the event for me all weekend while I was playing Annie, and I also want to note, just because I think it's important contextually, that in my 7-2, my matchup spread was very, very good in the sense that I played against 4 Kai'Sa matchups, 3 Yi matchups, and then I played against 1 MF Aurora, and then 1 Teemo. So while I didn't play against any mirrors or Sett matchups, which will be more popular assuredly next week, I think it is totally reasonable that for the week prior, that was about the matchup spread that you could expect if there wasn't a lot of variance in which matchups you got paired to, and that was really good for my testing process. So in those 7 rounds, I went 3-1 against Kai'Sa, 2-1 against Yi, and then I defeated the Aurora deck, and then I defeated the Teemo deck. And a couple things of note: the Yi matchup, I played against a fellow local here in Vegas, a very kind person. We played at, I believe, 5-1 in round 7. Although it could have been 4-1 in round 6. And I actually did, I think, have that game won and then threw it, which I don't love admitting at all. I'm actually pretty hard on myself with stuff like that. But I do think it's notable just for my opinion on the matchup going forward, as far as like where you need to shore up weak spots and then where you're strong. I do think that the matchup against Yi is quite good. I think it's quite favorable. For a few different reasons. First and foremost, is because of the rebuke for their late game stuff and the way that Fight or Flight interacts with a lot of their holding synergies, you end up just having a ton of agency over how the mid to late game plays out. It's actually really hard for them to ever get, the value that they used to snowball against a lot of opponents, like, holding on God Willow or, things of that nature. The other thing going on is Voidseeker lines up very well against them because of your legend ability. You very often kind of just get to play it for, 2 energy cheaper than you would otherwise. A lot of times it ends up being a really, really nice play to, like, play some units on your turn if they're already holding a battlefield. And then when they go to contest the other battlefield, you've readied 2 runes now. And then you can use that opportunity to Voidseeker the other unit at the other battlefield, and this does a couple things. This plays around a pump spell on the current battlefield because they'll be more incentivized to using it there, depending on the size of the unit. and it's also just more efficient for your board development, right? Because you got to play a unit presumably on your turn and use the removal spell on your opponent's turn. And plays like that, even though they look like they're mana efficient, right? Because you're trading 3 energy and a recycle for maybe something like a discipline or an unguard. A lot of times that somehow still ends up being net positive for you because you're getting to generate so many extra spells because of your legend ability. Uh, and that's not even counting the blowout scenarios. So the more I've played the matchup, the more I actually think the Master Yi players that are in the know might need to cut Charm against Annie. And I have not really seen any Yi player cut Charm under any circumstance. So I'm not really sure that that's an agreed upon thing. But all of my Yi opponents, all 3 of them, fell victim to trying to charm something over, and then me either having a cleave or a fight or flight to then completely blow them out, right? Because the interaction, for those that aren't in the know, obviously, is charm is very powerful in Yi because when you move a unit that an opponent controls to a battlefield you control, they're the attacker, so you get your +2 Master Yi buff. But what it does is it creates a showdown. And in this showdown, once I'm the attacker and I have focus, if I have a cleave, or even better, a fight or flight, which again, you have to remember, I'm Annie, so I'm always going to be representing one of these cards. I'm never going to be tapped out, right? Against other purple decks or other red decks, maybe you'll have the freedom to wait for them to spend all their energy, and you can use Charm that way where it's safe. That doesn't actually exist in this matchup, right? That situation will effectively never come up because I'll always be able to ready runes with my Annie ability. And yeah, if you, with action, fight or flight their unit back, you score that point on your opponent's turn, right? And obviously, worst case scenario is you cleave and they don't have a pump spell to then turn around and win the fight again. In both of those scenarios, if you're successful, the game is over. You've run away with the game. That amount of tempo is completely impossible to come back from. And that's 6 cards, right? That's 6 cards. And that's not even counting the opposing scenarios where things are just medium for your opponent, right? I mean, you still have 2 flash, right? Which, again, will always be up because of the Annie ability. So you can always flash away from the charm fight, right? And you don't have to recycle for that. So you're up an energy card, you're up a rune on that exchange. Still totally good. If your opponent doesn't control the other battlefield and they're charming something from your base to the base that they control, you do the same thing, right? You have action, you ride the wind over to the other battlefield, you score a point that way too, right? So there's a lot of pressure on them to control both battlefields now when they even play the charm in the first place. And you just create a bunch of horrific play patterns for the Master Yi deck. So in general, I think Yi is a deck that you should be quite favored against. It also helps that, like, you don't have any big cards in your sideboard, so you're not really, like, they can't just bring in Wind Walls or Mystic Reversals, right? It's not like they're getting any insane value out of those cards, and Defy is spread so thin, right? They only have 3 Defy. Like, look at how many spells we have that are important to our plan, right? Void Seeker, Flash, Ride the Wind, Fight or Flight, Rebuke. I mean, you can't even defy Rebuke anyways, of course. But there's only so many defies that they can draw in a game, and we're overloading on that aspect for sure. So I think the Yi matchup is quite strong. And the Kai'Sa matchup, I think it's not favored. To be very clear and to be blunt. But I do not think it's unplayable either. Like I said, I went 3-1 against Kai'Sa, and I suspect going forward that is something that you can kind of expect, right? I think my loss to Kai'Sa was against a very good opponent. It was in round 2, and I recognized their name from being an old Hearthstone pro, which I also played a bunch of back in the day. And they made very good decisions, and it was a pretty clean game. But I do think in general that matchup, while being slightly unfavored, is totally playable. I by no means think you sit down, play against Kai'Sa, and you should expect bad things to happen. Quite the contrary. I think you have a lot of good lines that make a lot of sense. So, for example, I like the version where, so for reference, my numbers are a little different. Like I said, I'm on 2 deckhand, 3 hopeful. I like leaning more into the mid-range style of things. I think anytime that you can be sitting with multiple 4-mite units in play, that is a good place to be. You just want to make their Falling Star a little bit worse. I'm also in 3 Pouty Poro for the same reason. You want to make Falling Star as bad as you can, right? Because the card is always going to be very good against you. It's always going to be very good against everybody. But the reality of the situation is you actually just play the early and mid-game turns much better than them. Because while they have cards that are very problematic, like Hextech Ray and Falling Star, if you maximize on things like the Poro, you actually end up in this scenario where you very often are trading up on energy counts and recycles, and that prevents their more powerful cards coming down later in the game, right? That can be problematic, right? Generally speaking, you should get to a Darius first. Generally speaking, it's going to take them a little bit longer to get to Watcher. Generally speaking, it's going to be harder for them to get any value out of a card like Time Warp. And the other thing going on is your spell density is just going to be so much higher in the early to mid game because of your legend ability. I'm going to keep mentioning that, but it really is, I think at this point, starting to come out in the light that the Annie legend is as powerful, if not more powerful, than the Kaisa legend ability. Both of them are cheating on resource manipulation very heavily, and usually coming from other games, those are the things that end up being the most overpowered and the most broken, right? Is the ways to cheat the resource system. Obviously, in a game like Magic, where I'm more familiar, the resource system, there's only one, right? So cheating on mana, as it's called, is generally going to be very powerful. In this game, there are 2 resource systems, and this is one of the champions that abuses one of those resource systems. And it's very clearly shown in deck design as well, right? You'll notice there aren't really any expensive cards in this shell and in any Annie shell, right? And the logic for that is because you don't actually need to hold on to recycles because you're getting higher spell density from just getting to play more cards on your opponent's turn. So that ends up being really valuable because I can play a card like a Vi on turn 1 or a card like a Void Seeker on turn 1 on the draw, 2 on the play, and losing that resource is just not actually going to hurt me as bad as it would a deck like Kaisa, for example, because I'm not trying to ramp up to play cards like Watcher and stuff like that, right? The reason the recycle is so important in current Kaisa builds is because it is keeping their energy count, their rune count high, and allowing them to play their Watchers on turn 4, their Time Warps on turn 5 or 6, etc. So yeah, I'm going to keep mentioning the Legend ability because I think it's so unbelievable. But again, specifically in the Kaisa matchup, something that I hadn't even gotten to yet, I preferred the mid-range angle because you can keep up with them on spell power and spell density. In fact, you can often jump ahead of them in the early game because you're more willing to play your throw your cards in for points. They're going to be trying to inherently create a lot more value, right? They're going to be trying to make sure that they don't commit their Kaisa until it's safe, that they don't commit their Darius until it's safe. Because of the existence of Ride the Wind Vi, which their deck has absolutely no answer for, they're cold to it in the entire color combination, you're actually much more capable of just throwing your cards in for points. And if you ever get to 6 points, they're in the danger zone, right? If you ever have a Kaisa player at 6 points, they should effectively expect to be losing the game, or be under immense pressure to ending the game on their following turn. And that ends up being a really powerful point of attack because Kaisa does not have anything like that can threaten you the same way. In fact, I would argue the opposite. A lot of their most powerful cards, like the Time Warps and the Watchers, are actually pretty poor against you. Some lists are even going towards Draven, which are also not very good against you, right? Because Rebuke and Fight or Flight and Ride the Wind and all of these purple tools answer those big units so well. And if you are playing around Time Warp, they answer Time Warp well also, right? Because even though none of this is reaction speed, unless Fight or Flight is hidden for some reason, which would never work anyways, because you couldn't use the Fight or Flight on a unit while it's hidden at a base you didn't control. But all of these purple cards just act so powerful into a lot of these slow, large units or slow, large spells, right? So I think the matchup is totally fine. While being a slight dog, I think, like I said, it is totally winnable. You have Gus in the sideboard, which, from my understanding, I'm not doing the Gus in the sideboard. I think you just want it as a way to keep a little bit of extra tempo when you're going second. I think oftentimes it can be really strong to have your turn 1 play on the draw be something along the lines of stack deck into hopeful or deckhand, and then when you ready your 2 runes, you just gust the thing that they try to attack with, that they played first, right away. So then you, in theory, get the hold points, which is really, really strong. And it gives you a chance to kind of jump point tempo, even when going second. Because a lot of times, and this is something that you learn from Magic as well, a lot of times, not exclusively, but a lot of times in the early game, a card like Gust is much better than in the mid to late game. Because if you Gust a 2-cost unit in the mid to late game, and they didn't have anything that they were going to spend those resources on, they just replay it, and all it was a slight tempo. They didn't get to attack with a unit for a turn. If you Gust a 2-drop on turn 1, and then they don't replay it on turn 2 because they want to play something like a Kaisa, well, then you almost kind of turn that Gust into a removal spell, right? Because for 1 mana, you dealt with a 2-drop, and then they didn't replay it until potentially the 3rd or even 4th turn. And that ends up being really close to 1 colorless energy, destroy target 2-cost unit, which that card would obviously be way too good if it existed, right? That card would be completely broken. So in those scenarios, Gust can be exceptionally powerful, and my suspicion is that's what the idea was behind this. I would assume the Gust are not in the deck very often when you're on the play, and against Kaisa in particular, because, again, my gut understanding is if Gust was that good against Kaisa, on average, you would just main deck them, all of them, right? I think it's, like, totally fine in the world we're living in to have your deck be pre-boarded against Kaisa. I think it's much more of a when you're going second thing. Second Rebuke makes a lot of sense for the other big decks. Vayne, while I'm not a big enjoyer of this card, I understand kind of why it exists. It is nice in the matchups where you're trading points to have a permanent threat that ends up in a zone they can't interact with, right? A lot of decks have the ability to, if you attack with a Kaisa or a Darius, it's very vulnerable on their turn. They're just going to attack it down with a fellow accelerated unit. And while Vayne is reasonably underpowered, it is very good at playing that game, especially when you don't have other ways to spend your mana, or your energy, rather. Because this deck can play low resource pretty well, right? You're recycling a lot of your stuff early, a lot of your runes, and you're spinning a lot of your cards on tempo-positive plays, like fighter flighting units back to base, gusting them back to hand. So you end up in this scenario where you might be low on threats, and in that scenario, Vayne can absolutely overperform. And then I'm very happy to see Fading Memories get some play. This is a card that I had been playing, that I was seeing in effectively 0 lists for a very long time. And this card, not only is it like very obviously good against large units, it's very good against the card Aurora, and it doesn't suffer the same frailties that a card like Acceptable Losses does, because not all of the lists of MF Aurora play, but a large percentage of the lists of MF Aurora will play the Treasure Trove package. And obviously Acceptable Losses, which should be one of your best cards, ends up being a massive do-nothing in a lot of those spots. So I think playing the Fading Memories makes a ton of sense there. Alright, so we can go on to the next deck, which is going to be the second place list in Vegas. And that is going to be Ryan M. So, this list looks reasonably stock. I don't know about, multiple time warps, neither here nor there on that. But yeah, I think this list is super stock, at least in the main deck. 1 rain, 2 time warp, lots of 2-drops, right? This list is 8 2-drops, really leaning into the aggressive slant. 3 hopeful, 3 yordle, 3s fully across the board, just playing all the broken cards, 2 copies of Kaisa, 2 time warp. And yeah, I do not think that there's a whole lot to discuss about this main deck. I think this is incredibly stock. And I think our time would be much better spent mostly talking about sideboard choices. But yeah, this is Public Enemy number 1 still, right? There is no reason to suspect anything else. This is public enemy number 1. This is about what the list you should expect to play against look like. Maybe there's an extra Cathian Rain. Maybe there's, one less Time Warp. But everything else, this person just said, I've decided what I think all the best cards are. I'm playing 3 of all of them, right? And that is a totally valid approach to deck building. Notably, their battlefield choice, I do like getting away from the double hold battlefield. I think that didn't make a lot of sense. My suspicion is that they start on Dreaming Tree, use Vile Maul Lair when they're going second, and Zon when they're going first, especially against the mirror match, because they have a Mundo in their sideboard. I think that makes a lot of sense as well, to just help card filter out for your trash. And then in the sideboard, we have Smokescreen, 2 Thermo Beam, 1 Progress Day, 2 Bryn here, which is very interesting, and then a Cathian Rain and Mundo. So, while I don't know for sure, I would suspect that the Cathian Rain and the Mundo and the Progress Day are your 3-card package that comes in the mirror, and then you cut cards accordingly based on if you're on play draw. Generally speaking, if you're going second, you can trim a couple 2-drops because you open up the ability to stupefy their first play plus Hopeful, or just play a Yordle. Totally valid options to do. And when you're going first, you kind of have the option of, if you're interested in trimming, any number of the other expensive cards or cheap cards, right? You kind of, a lot of people like playing those matchups quite differently, so it's just more of a player agency thing. Smokescreen, of course, a very valuable tool against decks like, Yi midrange, or any other kind of midrange shell, where you really are trying to fight on enemy territory. Thermo Beam, a card I haven't loved, but I think being cold to an Aurora deck doesn't really make a lot of sense. There's also a lot of decks that are starting to really look into abusing gears. So if that ends up being a strategy a lot of people in Houston want to look into abusing, if there's people that are, playtesting decks in secret, I think it is much better to have Thermo Beam in your sideboard than not, because if any of those decks end up being really popular or really powerful, that is a tool that I think you're going to be very happy to have access to, right? And quite frankly, I've said this before as well in other videos, but I think it's worth reiterating here. I just think your sideboard slots in general are less valuable in Kai'Sa. I think blue-red as a color combination just doesn't really have access to the same banger, shutdown cards that other colors do. And I think due to that reality, having a card that just has such a high upside, if you find yourself in the right spot for it, is just good deck building in general. And then last but not least, Bryn Thundersong. So this is a card that I've looked at in Annie as well, though I admit I haven't pulled the trigger on it yet. This card is very interesting. In my deck, I was considering it as a tool to guarantee against other archetypes that Vi Ride the Wind would go through. I think that's really powerful, and it lines up pretty well if you ever get up to the 10 resources, right? Because you can play everything in one turn. That's pretty hard to do with Annie because you play on low resource so often, which is why I don't actually think it's doable, but something that I've considered. Here, you do actually get to the high resource counts, so it is a reasonable thing that you can expect. The difference here is that I'm not actually sure what they're trying to fight here. I don't think that there's a lot of decks that are trying to play on your opponent's turn other than Annie. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was a card that you brought in against Annie, just as a way to, you start a turn with 6 points and your Annie opponent has, a bunch of ready runes. They might be confident between their removal spells and their purple spells that they can keep you off of your final couple of points. And obviously Bryn just completely shuts that down. It starts a chain, and if they don't have spells that they can utilize right then and there, then the window is closed, and you should pretty easily be able to win the game. But this deck also doesn't abuse the 6 energy into a bunch of accelerate units, right? I mean, there's actually no way to play Bryn plus 2 accelerate units in the deck, since there's no rear guards. So that's something that maybe I would like to see adapted. If you decide that this card is good, right? Yeah, you have to decide that this card is one that you want to play. But my immediate suspicion is that this card is like good against Annie and maybe good against Yi if you're worried about pump spells or something like Stun Prison, Rune Prison, the Master Yi stun card that people are playing. But I think this card has potential. I'm just not actually convinced there's enough to justify it taking up 2 sideboard slots currently. But as I've mentioned before, also, it does have the ability to just be a shut-the-door game winner. And I think there is more value to playing cards like that in Kai'Sa than in other archetypes because of the opportunity cost, right? Like, I just don't think the sideboard is very valuable in Kai'Sa very often. And what would these slots be instead, right? Just more smoke screens or more of the same, right? More cards that you already have redundant copies of. So I think that this deck building makes a lot of sense. And it's at least coherent. And like I said, I think this is kind of, if you're setting up the gauntlet to do a lot of games against the perceived decks that you'll play against in Houston, this should effectively be your starting point for Kai'Sa. I think this is the list that you should run the gauntlet against. I think this is the kind of version that you're most likely to play against in Houston. All right, now we get to go over to the other side of the country, where we have a little Sett action. Colin Kaiser took down Atlanta with Sett the Boss. And there's a couple notable things here that I think are worth discussing. I do not have a ton of reps on or against Sett, so a lot of what I'm going to do, admittedly, is theory. I don't have a lot of the played experience, but, you know, I think a lot of the points that I'm going to argue still stand, or even if I'm not making points, I'm more or less just, you know, mentioning the obvious so that there can be discussion points. And if I do mention something that sounds off or wrong, you know, let me know in the comments, right? I'm preparing for Houston just like everybody else, right? It's, you know, by no means are a lot of my plans or ideas perfect. But the first thing that I noticed about this list, there were twofold. Two things that I noticed. First thing was Sabotage's main, which I think this is the one deck that can pretty easily get away with that because it's so comfortable playing on low resource. I've seen cards like Sabotage played in Master Yi midrange and in MF Aurora in the main deck, and I think that is poor deck building on average. I think those decks value getting to the mid to late game resource count so heavily, and they're so reliant on them in some cases. In Aurora's case in particular, right, because of the namesake card Aurora. But I think this is one of the first decks I've seen where you play the Sabotage in the main deck, and it actually makes sense, right? Because every deck is going to have spells that you care about. Every deck, right? There's not a single deck that is like, you know, 26 units, 12 spells, or whatever, right? That doesn't really exist. So, and I think a lot of times this is the kind of deck where the information is going to be more powerful too, right? You're also, you just have access to some of the most powerful cheap cards, right? I mean, Showstopper, incredibly powerful at a 1-in-1 cost. Call to Glory, free, right, most of the time. Incredibly powerful tool. A lot of challenge, a very, again, I'm going to make this same comparison, a very low floor, high ceiling card, because if you don't have, you know, interaction prepared, things can go poorly, so you have to be really confident that you're going to win the exchange. All of these combining tools end up making Sabotage a really powerful main deck inclusion because you get the information, right? You get to look at your opponent's hand of presumably 5 or 6 cards, and you get to, not only do you get to take a card, but you now get to play around everything that your opponent has and make their gameplay decisions very difficult. That is a strategy that is very powerful in Magic the Gathering, and when your deck is built for it to where the resource denial doesn't hurt you and you're comfortable playing on low resources, I see no reason why the same shouldn't be true here. Other notable things to me, this deck is on 0 Divine Judgment, which I was kind of under the assumption that that was one of the main reasons to play Sett, is because it was a deck that was able to play on low resource so well, better than pretty much every other deck, that it was a card that if you ever got to cast it was an I win button. And I wonder if that was just a bit overblown, because obviously Colin won the event without it, but it turns out, I think that getting to the 5, 7, 9 range of runes is actually just very difficult with this deck and not how the deck wants to play out at all, right? If you deny playing, a Hidden Blades down on a battlefield you're controlling, or if you deny playing one of your good 4-cost units that require recycling, just so you can ramp up a little bit to your Divine Judgment, I think your net equity is actually going to be down, right? I think this deck goes very far by just always adding to the board the most powerful setup that it can, and then setting up its defenses via the buffs and the Sett Boss Legend ability. And I think the whole, not the entirety of it, but I think a massive amount of this deck's strength is actually just leaning into the Sett Boss ability and having a lot of redundancy on your board and always a lot of power back home in your base, as it were, when your opponent tries to use removal spells and combat effectively, right? So my initial suspicion is that a lot of the people that were trying Divine Judgment maybe were having some success with it, and it was making them a little disillusioned. But I would suspect it is not an accident that this list without it won, and then going forward, I think you should expect them to not have it as well. I think getting up to those resource counts is going to end up doing more harm than good to your overall plan, and you should just plan for being as aggressive as possible, as often as possible. Another very important thing that I think is worth mentioning about this deck, again, while not being a Sett expert, no orange Sett in the main deck. Both of them are sitting in the sideboard. There are definitely some matchups where that is going to be better than others. I suspect Yi is one of them, although a lot of Yi decks are also bringing in the Rune Prisons now, so maybe that changes. But yeah, a lot of these Sett decks, or this one in particular, looks like they were leaning into yellow Sett and holding a lot more than lists that I had seen previously, which is, I think, really interesting. Another interesting note, this deck leans much more into the mid-range, right? This deck is playing the full 5, 10, one of them is a champion unit, a chosen champion. So 10 4-cost units, which is a huge percentage of your deck. Most set lists that I've seen are more likely trying to spam the board. They're playing something like Glory Seeker that will buff itself on second cast. And they're playing, 9 to 10, sometimes in some cases I've seen even more 2-drops. And I can imagine a world where that makes you run out of resources even more quickly than you would otherwise. And it just makes your deck overall less powerful and less beefy, right? Notably also, you want to be using your buff on more mid-range units. Using your Sett ability on a 2-cost unit is, of course, much less valuable than using it on a 4-cost or a 6-cost unit. So leaning into that deck-building philosophy, I think, makes a lot of sense, and I think it's no real surprise that Colin was rewarded with that. I think most people have kind of concluded now that for deck-building purposes, 6 to 8 is kind of the maximum 2-drops you want under most circumstances, and the only reason that you would really lean into more is if you're trying to do some Legion stuff, like with Noxus Hopeful. I think that ends up being the most common. In any other deck build, most often, I think you just want the bare minimum, the 6 or 7 number, just to make sure that you have a play on turn 1, because having a play on turn 1 is so important. And then I think you just want to make sure that you have a bunch of mid-game and late-game cards to keep jamming into your opponent. I think that ends up just being a better deck-building philosophy on average, which is nice to see because I think most other games don't actually operate that way. A lot of other games, the cheapest cards are just far and away the best cards, and I think this particular archetype is helped by the fact that you have so many free cards, right, between Call of Glory and Hidden Blades. And then Arena Bar to some degree, because once you pay the cost, you get a lot of activations out of it throughout the rest of the game. But yeah, I think this archetype makes a ton of sense. I think Sett historically just has some of the best sideboarding, right? The Third Sabotage, the Unyielding Spirits against Kaisa, the Salvages, the Decree. I just think all of these cards are such bangers. To make a juxtaposition for how I said I dislike the Kaisa sideboard and why Kaisa is a deck that I'm basically not entertaining and playing at all, is I think I get a lot of equity out of my sideboarded games. And look at how much more powerful, on average, the cards you're bringing in with this Sett deck are going to be in the particular matchups you want them for versus the just generically good cards that Kaisa is bringing in, right? This sideboard looks awesome, and I think the deck is fast enough that you should generally expect to be able to get the full 3 games in and utilize your sideboard better than other archetypes. I think this deck looks great. It's definitely going to be in my range of decks that I'm interested in playing with. And I think this is for sure step 1 of Sett. I think that if you're playtesting against Sett, or if you're thinking about playing Sett, this should be your starting point. I think this deck is more likely to be a better payoff, especially learning the archetype, than starting with any of the orange Sett builds that have been more common. This is now the most proven, even though it's just one tournament. I think winning a tournament against other people that are very much in the know and very competent is better than a large percentage of decks just being played at local events and having some modicum of success, right? So this should be, I think, your starting point for Sett moving forward. And then last, but certainly not least, my homie, Luna Love, for those that don't know, was an old Hearthstone pro back in the day, currently a Magic pro, and a very close friend of mine. I've known her for a very long time, and I was so ecstatic to see her get second place. Obviously, I would have preferred her winning, all bias aside, because I'm just human, and I'm going to be biased, rooting for my friends. And this list looks awesome. This list is mostly stock, although I think everybody kind of acknowledges I don't think there's a ton of variability with a lot of the mid-range builds. Once you decide that you want to be mid-range versus the Aurora build, I think that's where a lot of the player agency comes in, and there aren't too many what we would call in other games flex slots. But there are a couple here that I think are worth talking about. Most mid-range decks have kind of concluded. These are the 9 2-drops that you want. It's so important for you to get on the board fast so you can start getting your hold value, because every time that you have a unit on a board, getting that +2 Yi buff, you are creating inherent card advantage because your opponent must either spend extra cards or extra resources that most 2-drops would not absorb to be removed. In addition to that, Keeper provides really nice value because if you happen to play these other 2 units earlier in the game, Keeper creates a lot of value by drawing you a card in the mid to late game when you're flush on resources. Luna decided that she wanted 7 of the big cards. 8 if you count Yi, but Yi is your chosen champion, so you always have access to that. 7 is on the lower end, right? I think most people conclude between 7 and 9. 9 being on the extreme end, 7 being on the low to mid end. Some people will go as low as 6. 7 is the number that I like as well, personally. I know a lot of people that have actually not figured out which one they like more between Feyfolk and Protector. Most people that I'm in discussions with prefer 3 Predator, just because it has so much comeback potential, right? Yi is a deck that does not play from behind exceptionally well. You're very reliant on charms in the early to mid game, so I think having Predator to catch back up in the mid to late game is very valuable. 3 Hourglasses, I think, mostly common, although I do see some people trimming on those. I get it. It can line up pretty poorly against Kaisa if you just have a bunch of 2-drops sitting on your base and they have Falling Star, but I think, them's the breaks. I think the times where you get the value out of one of your big units is so strong that you pretty much just are locked into playing the 3. That's been kind of an opinion of mine in the Yi deck for a little bit now. And then Rune Prison and Catalyst are the other spice cards here, because I think Spirit and Sabotage make a ton of sense. Protector also makes a lot of sense, but I'm interested now to kind of see what level 2 of this is, because while I haven't discussed this with Luna at all, I would imagine her plan was that White Flame Protector was really good in the mirror match because it just gave you the ability to go over the top of whatever big unit your opponent had sitting on a battlefield. And I wonder if that's less true now with her popularizing Rune Prison, because obviously investing in one gigantic unit is much worse when Rune Prison is a more popularly played card. So I'm really interested to see if that's what the White Flame was for, or if there were other spots where she thought it was particularly valuable. And then the one of Catalyst, obviously it might look a little undirected, but my suspicion here is that it just has a lot of equity in the game where you're picking Obelisk, right? Any game where you're picking Obelisk, turn 1 Catalyst is just going to give you so much agency because it's going to give you the ability to play a Fatefolk or a Predator on turn 2 or other things, right? I mean, in those scenarios, turn 2 double 2-drop or Wielder plus 2-drop plus Find Your Center ends up being a really powerful turn 2, I think, on average as well. So I think this is just a little bit of spice that makes sense for an extra card that you want in your opening hand for your Obelisk games, and probably not coming in much more often, I would imagine. Though, admittedly, I'm not 100% sure. And then, yeah, the Wielder is kind of the last thing that I want to talk about her list, just because you don't see this in a lot of Yi lists. And I like it. I'm a big enjoyer. I've been a big enjoyer of Wielder for some time, even in just any green decks, not even Yi in particular. It does have the downside of being a 3-cost that is very susceptible to Falling Star, which is a notable weakness, right? I don't really want to undersell that. But in the games where it doesn't get Falling Starred, it's so massive with the Yi ability, right? I mean, Defend Alone Yi, Defend Alone Wielder, you're looking at a 6-might unit. And the relevancy there, the reason that I like the card is I think a lot of these decks that care about getting to high resource counts, high rune counts, benefit a lot from playing very powerful cards that don't require recycling, right? It's kind of the reason why you see Find Your Centers in all these decks, even though drawing a bunch of Find Your Centers in the early game can be, really, really harming to your development. These cards that let you affect the board and not poorly affect your resource count end up being really valuable. So in games where your ideal scenario is playing a 2-drop on turn 1, obviously most Yi players would tell you that playing a Kiana on turn 2 and then looking for a Conquer is very powerful, right? And I think it's telling that is still true even in this list, because you're playing 3 copies of Kiana, 2 copies of Wielder. I think the more important part to the story is that Luna concluded that there was nothing else that was as good in this slot as Kiana, that without also requiring a recycle. So she just decided to play a modicum level threat that doesn't require the recycle. So if you go turn 1 without recycling and then turn 2 also without recycling, well, now there's a couple things going on. Now if you were on the draw, your turn 3 play can actually just be a Master Yi or a Tasty Fatefolk, right? Or it can be, a larger quantity of spells, right? Maybe you get to make an attack and sit on a bunch of charms on guards, right? And in those scenarios, or when you're going first and you're on 6, well, now you're just more likely to be at 8 on turn 4, or to be at 7 on turn 4 if you're having a big turn with, your charms again and your cards that require recycling after the fact. I think these cards that don't require recycling in decks that don't play seals are going to get better as more cards come out, or as more copies of those types of cards come out, right? I think you were seeing that in decks like Teemo, where people were really big on Ember Monk, and I think they were big on Ember Monk for that reason, right? Ember Monk, 4 energy, 4 might. Obviously, the Teemo deck hides a bunch, so you can expect it to be 6 or even 8 in some particularly good combats. But realistically, I think the main reason that card was seeing play is because it just didn't require recycling, which let you just more consistently get to your Mundo, more consistently get to your Watcher if you were playing them, more consistently have extra resources to spend so that you could do your Teemo picking up and hiding, nonsense, right? So that ends up being really, really powerful, and I think that's what a lot of Luna's decision-making led her to with these Wielders. And, yeah, I love that the 2 tournaments gave us 4 different deck lists to look at, and quite honestly, I think it was a perfect breakdown. I think the West really lucked out in their tournament setup, their tournament prep, where you have 4 different decks to look at that went 1-2 on each side of the country, and a lot of information that people are wanting to be prepared for Houston. So I'm looking forward to it. I hope you guys are as well. If you see me in Houston, come say hi. I'd love to chat with you. I love meeting everybody. This game, the community has been a lot of fun. And yeah, I think we're going to call it there. If you enjoyed this kind of stuff, go ahead and throw me out a like, a comment, and a subscribe. It does help out the algorithm. And I would like to just kind of be a soundboard for people that have their own interests and ideas as well. I think this is a really important week for prep, and I know personally it is very important for me to do well. I would really like doing well at this event, and I'm going to be putting a lot of effort into that. So hopefully you guys will as well. And until next time, guys, I appreciate it. I'll see you later. Peace.